morning. Welcome everybody to this month's archaeology lecture for the Office of State Archaeology. I wanted to make a few quick announcements about our upcoming Archaeology Month. So next month, October, is going to be North Carolina Archaeology Month, and we have a number of events that I would like you all to know about and come to if you're able. On October 12th, we're going to have our Arc in the Park, a public archaeology day at Pullen Park from 11 to 2 p.m. On October 18th, we're going to have the Perspectives of Women in North Carolina Archaeology panel talk. That'll be over at the Museum of History, starting from 3 o'clock to 4:30 with a archaeological meet and greet to follow, and that will be at North Street Beer Station, starting at 5 o'clock. And I hope that you all will be able to attend. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Sarah Lowry. She is the Director of Geophysics and Archaeologist for New South and Associates. She has been working for New South since 2009. And she got her BA and MA at the University of Denver. And she has worked all over the Southeast, including Belize, Bolivia, and Ecuador. So today she'll talk about some of the work that she's done in the Tennessee River Valley. And let's please give her a welcome applause.
Well, thank you all for having me. I'm very honored to be here. So today I'm going to kind of informally go through the results. That is not how that was supposed to happen. Today I'm going to kind of informally go through the results from 6 large-scale geophysical projects we have completed in the Tennessee River Valley. At each site, I'm going to kind of summarize what we thought we knew before the geophysics, and then I'm going to talk about the results of the geophysical survey. I'll sort of start with an introduction to archaeological geophysics, very brief since I know a lot of you know a lot about it. And then I'm going to kind of talk about archaeology of the Mississippian period in East Tennessee and then I'm going to go through each site by site. So David kind of talked about my background. I've been doing this for about 12 years now, New South for about 10. We work on cemeteries, pre-contact sites, and historic sites across the Southeast and really across the United States. But these projects are probably career highlights for me, and I would say they're projects I've just had a real honor to be a part of the archaeological work on them. Okay, so archaeological geophysics, a lot of you have seen ground penetrating radar. I'm going to kind of highlight the 2 methods that we use the most and have found the most useful. So this is ground penetrating radar, or GPR. It sends electromagnetic energy through the ground. That energy reflects off of changes through the ground, and the computer records both the strength of the reflection and the time elapsed it travels. The time is used as a proxy for distance, and the relative reflection strength is recorded and used to identify features, both using the geometry of that strength and its context in the site. So every GPR system, no matter how you see it set up and what cart or configuration it's on, is going to have a computer and an antenna. Most GPR systems you see will have some sort of method for recording distance. So that's a survey wheel on this, the baby jogger setup. And then there's a computer. We are sending electromagnetic energy through the ground with this handy illustration you can see. And we get back something that we call a profile. And this is very analogous to like a trench wall profile. And this is depth here, and here's distance along the ground. And then you can see, I think this is a historic house basement here. And then we put all those profiles together. We get a 3-dimensional block of data, and we can slice that in what can be equivalent to arbitrary levels. So we use ground penetrating radar for anything that has a distinct difference from the surrounding material. So graves, architectural features, transportation, any sort of ground modification where you're going to see a difference between what is the normal soil or the normal ground material and this change. So magnetic gradiometer. The Earth has a magnetic field that's naturally occurring, and the magnetometer measures local changes in that magnetic field. So there are two sensors. In this system, these sensors are each, the system we use has two sensors, I should say. This is a Bardington, and it has, each of these sensors is measuring an independent transect. And this is what a transect looks like. And you can see it's just numbers. So unlike GPR, you're not getting that three-dimensional data. You're just getting a single plane of data. But it can be very useful to measure both natural and cultural changes in the soil. So natural changes would be like topsoil changes, weathering. Soils will have different magnetic susceptibility, and natural fire or burning. But culturally, we'll see fires or heating, like hearths, kilns, or building burns, which are very common in kind of a Native American tradition to burn buildings. The use of burned materials such as brick or ceramic trash accumulation. And human occupation will increase the food for biogenic bacteria, so you can see like middens, often with a mag, or the human accumulation or removal of topsoil. So if someone digs a ditch, builds a road or pathway, or humans bringing in iron or making iron or bringing in metal. And so the problem with mag is it can be less useful for sites, historic sites or sites with modern or historic components on them. So you might only see the historic materials, the metal, and you might miss the more subtle prehistoric or pre-contact deposits. So the example I have right here is actually kind of a bad example. But this is the Elizabeth Cady Stanton house right here. I just thought it was a good example for trailblazers. But you can see here none of the outbuildings from the house. All you can see are the property lines that are actually post-date the Elizabeth Cady Stanton's occupation by quite a bit. And you can see that there's rebar reinforcement in the sidewalk here. We did other methods of geophysics that were more successful there. So to the Mississippian period, kind of all the sites I'm going to talk about today have been the study of kind of a historic archaeological archaeologists, and there's lots of, they've all had historic excavations done by the Smithsonian, the WPA, UT, and TVA reservoir projects. So we you know, in addition to doing the geophysics, we kind of mined this historical archaeological information. And as just a quick aside on because we're talking about women in archaeology this year and this month, all these historic excavations were primarily done by men. They were the people who worked on these reservoir projects tend to read like a who's who in southeastern archaeology lists, and often they were major stepping stones for a lot of careers in southeastern archaeology, and they would not let women in the field. In fact, the only women they would let in the field, my understanding, is African American laborers, who they still made wear dresses. But some prominent women did come kind of from that WPA era archaeology, most notably for my work, Madeline Nieberg, who was a pioneer in southeastern archaeology. She wasn't allowed in the field at all, though she had a PhD in anthropology from Chicago, but she did manage the lab work and drove publication for a lot of these studies, a couple that I'm going to talk about today. And kind of when we go back and look at the notes, she probably did more than she got credit for. And some other really prominent women emerged and kind of from Nieberg, very prominently Lynn Sullivan, who's a collaborator on a lot of these projects for us. She's a retired curator at the McClung Museum at UT. She's a huge champion of Nieberg's work, made sure a bunch of her work got published. And also in her own research, she gave women agency as actors in prehistory, which was something that wasn't happening on a lot of these sites before. She looked at descendant tribes and their matrilineal structure and realized that women may have had more of a role. It wasn't just male-run chiefdoms. She's also been a mentor to many other women who have come up in southeastern archaeology, and it was just a great pleasure to work with on these projects. So back to the sites. All these sites have current or have had historic issues with looting. And there is some question about whether some of this early archaeology was looting itself. All the sites have, the TVA has the question on all these sites about how much is left. We see all these maps showing extensive excavations, and they are wondering what is left. Is there any archaeology left at these sites? Between the inundation of the river and these previous excavations and the looting, is there any archaeology left? I think you guys all know where I'm going with that. So here's just, these are just really cool images. These are all sites that I'm going to talk about today, from the WPA archives of men working, but really cool artifacts identified on the sites. So I think most of you all know this, but I included this slide just because I'm going to talk a little bit about village organization structure, and I wanted to sort of give the briefest background to Mississippian culture. It's considered to take place in East Tennessee from about 900 to 1600 AD. It can be divided into the early, kind of middle and late period, and there's many subdivisions in that within the categories based on kind of cultural affiliation and period. I'm going to keep it pretty simple for the purposes of this talk, but I thought this was a really nice image from Tokwa, which I'm not going to talk about today, but it does kind of show what sorts of features we're looking for with the geophysics. They're typically palisaded villages or ditch villages. In the later periods, you start to see bastions and the village walls. Structures within the villages surrounding a plaza and a mound, typically, sometimes more than one mound, sometimes more than one plaza. And the structures will be both community structures and domestic structures. Typically, these sites are along a river, some sort of waterway. So I'm going to discuss all of our sites in the order that we did the surveys from 2013 to 2019. They all had complete gradiometer coverage, and everything but one had GPR, either targeted or complete GPR coverage. And I'm going to go pretty quickly, but I hope to kind of give you a taste of the results that we found. And you can see here, this is the Tennessee River Valley, and we've got a tributary. They're all either on the Tennessee River. They're in the Tennessee River Valley, and they're either all on the Tennessee River or on its tributaries. So the first one was our first project in 2013, the Cox Mound, which is actually in Alabama. We did the geophysical survey we did a much larger geophysical survey of the shoreline of the Tennessee River here, and I'm going to focus right on the Mound site, the northern part of it. We did a mag survey of the whole area, and then a systematic GPR sampling along the shoreline. And part of the reason for that was we were looking for shell levees. What we did know about this site was that the WPA did a bunch of work on it. They excavated the mound in the center of the site, and those excavation maps kind of gave us an idea of what types of features we were looking for, but we had no idea where those maps were located. As common with anyone who's looked at these kind of early 20th century archaeological maps, they can be beautiful like this. This is a really gorgeous scale map, but we didn't know where it was in space. You can really barely see the mound today. We didn't know where they excavated on the mound. So we identified a 5-acre site around the mound with a previously unknown palisade. So we knew the mound was there, but no one, including the WPA, identified this palisade. And then we also identified the WPA trenches, which you can see up here. It's the square trenches where they kind of cross-sectioned the mound. And we were able to identify this either possible pre or post extension of the village. and then what is either a pre or post occupation, like up north of the palisaded village. And so we produced a kind of management level map for the TVA, so they had an understanding of what the resources were. They get cooler as we go up through time. In 2014, we did the Bell site, which is probably one of my favorite sites that I've ever worked on. It's a natural island on the Tennessee River. And I say natural because a lot of islands were formed when the river was flooded. So this island has always been an island. And before we came out there, we knew it was a Mississippian village with multiple mounds. Lewis and Nash had excavated it in the WPA period, and they had identified 7 mounds on it. And you can see they're actually highlighted on here. This mound is quite large. It's still very large today, even after the plowing. And then there's mounds here and here, another pretty large mound right here, and then another mound down here, which this one is unknown. I still don't actually think it's a mound. A rise on the landscape. And then this is a historic road, farm road, and this is a natural levee. So we did a Gradyometer survey over the entire accessible area of the island, about 20 acres of Gradyometer survey, and then a GPR survey of about 9 acres. You can see the Gradyometer is in red and the GPR is in blue on this map. So when Lewis and Nash came and did the excavations here, they actually didn't write a report of their excavations. And this is actually pretty common in those archaeology, the WPA period, because after World War II started, they dropped these projects, and there's very often no reports written on them. In fact, we really don't know much about what they did because the only documentation we have is from their excavations on the largest mound. Here's the results, just the very quick results of the mag, and I'm going to come back to this. And then just showing where we did the GPR. They did, their excavations focus mostly on the largest mound in the back of the island, but they also, the other mound excavations were only documented by feature forms. So we don't really know much about what they found or where they found it. They also didn't tend to keep artifacts that we would keep today, so it's very difficult for us to kind of reconstruct what happened at the Bell site. A lot of the other sites we had more notes and drawings than this one. So we were able to identify the mound complex on the west side of the island in the village area to the east. So this village area has at least partially surrounded by a palisade, which we previously had not known. And you can see here where the palisade is either doubled or has been expanded or contracted slightly. And here's where that levee is, which is also covered with midden. And these are middens, and here's that mound. We sort of hypothesized 3 occupation zones on the Bell site. So zone 1 is that mound complex, which we have some evidence from the mound occupation of the mound excavations that it was Hiawassee Island phase, or like kind of a middle Mississippian period. But there is no evidence from the GPR or the excavations that there was really a village occupation in between those mounds. So, which is kind of different. It's different than those pictures that, the Tokwa example that I was showing you. We don't know, we actually don't know. They could have, if they lived down on the other side of the island or somewhere that's underwater now, or what was going on. Zone 2 is that walled village and mound complex, which based on some artifacts found and some of the architecture and the fact that it's a walled village around a single mound, we think that's kind of a later period occupation, Dallas phase occupation. And then there's kind of this outside of the mound area, which we hypothesized kind of called Zone 3, which is, we're guessing it might be a late Dallas or something referred to as Mouse Creek in the region occupation. So people were no longer living in walled villages. So the mound on the west side of the island, Mound 51, was thought to have been completely excavated by Lewis and Nash. And we found evidence that there was still intact stratum on the mound, which is great. That they only excavated about halfway down, and because you can see it, they did move a lot of dirt. There are people on this right there, but we don't actually think they destroyed the whole mound. They're still intact deposits. We were able to georeference their excavation maps using the magnetometer data that we had. It's not perfect, but we got pretty close, so we can have an idea about where they actually did dig on the mound. So the next project I'm going to talk about is Hiawassee Island, which is, we did work on 2015. This is a natural island at the confluence of the Tennessee and the Hiawassee rivers. It's a Mississippian site with multiple mounds, shell mids, and burial mounds, and it's considered kind of a type site for Mississippian sites in East Tennessee. We did 151 acres of Gradyometer Survey on Hiawassee Island of all the open, non-submerged areas, and a targeted survey of 33 acres of GPR data. I'm only going to talk about the Mississippian Village today. We did identify multiple historic sites and possibly some other maybe non-Mississippian pre-contact sites on the island. This project was, as you can imagine, quite the undertaking logistically, but it was really amazing to work on. So on the north side of the island, which is up here, which is where the village site, we knew that this was the village site prior to arriving. Lewis and Nieberg excavated a large platform mound on the north side of the island, and then a couple of block excavations, and that's really what we knew from their maps. And they did publish a kind of monograph on Hiawassee Island, which I really encourage, if you have not seen, to seek out, because it is one of the most, it's a really beautiful volume. And it's really nice to see something published on these sites. So they excavated large platform mounds on the northern side of the island, and you can see in this picture they were kind of double platform mounds. And here's a diagram, and they're up here. And now this shoreline, of course, does not represent what we see today. After damming, a lot of this is no longer here. And they did identify one palisade bounding the village, and we're still not quite sure how they identified, like what methods they used to map that. Before the geophysical survey, this site was thought to have been completely excavated and looted. Now, if you go to where those platform mounds are close to where they were, it looks like the craters of the moon. Like there are giant looters' pits in it. And it actually was, I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but it was determined not eligible for the National Register by Tennessee. They thought there was no research potential remaining. Everything is either underwater, had been excavated, or had been looted. So we did, here's the Gradyometer map, and I think you start to see some features on here. You can see the plow lines. You can also see this bastioned palisade ringing the village. And if you look very closely, and I'm going to highlight them in a later slide, some smaller palisades or ditches coming around this village area. Right here, we actually came back and did some test excavations here with the TVA, and these are actually not a palisade, it's a trench. Pretty big trench full of trash. So anyone's guess is what that was. A trench full of burned rocks and shell. So we identified 6 palisades, ditches, or village boundaries, mapping the expansion and contraction of the village, all of which had been previously unknown. We have that one palisade that Lewis and Nieberg identified, but we actually couldn't figure out which one they found. We determined that we couldn't really georeference the WPA maps here because most of the shoreline is completely different, and the most of their excavation units are probably actually either in that wood line or basically have eroded away. We think that kind of working outward from where the mounds were, that their block excavations are actually no longer here. And so most of what we found is completely new. And this is about a 17 to 20 acre village for a little context. So here's sort of our annotated map. And we don't really know still what order, if these mark expansion or contraction of the village. There is a distribution of structures, middens, and a possible borrow area from the mound construction. So everything in brown here is a structure, I think. We've got some of these shell areas, which are also, we really don't know what those are. We did some excavations, and they are very dense shell. But it's very unclear why they're so far from the village. And you can see this is very dense structure. I mean, these are probably not all inhabited at one time. Some of them are burned, some of them are not. And then here's that mound, those big twin mounds. And this, we think, was a borrow for the creation of these two mounds. So next, Ledford Island, which we did this work in 2016. It's a well-preserved late Mississippian village site on another natural island. It's on the Hiawassee River. We did the entire cleared area with Gradyometer, which is about 61 acres, and a targeted GPR survey of about 14 acres. And I'm going to talk about where the Mississippian village is down here. And in case you were wondering, it was really cold. I can see all the sympathy in your eyes. There were other sites up on the northern part of the island, and but I'm going to focus down here on 40BY13, which is the Mississippian component. You can see a little preview of our results here. And same with the GPR. So Lewis and Nieberg had been here as well, Hiawassee Island and Ledford. They never published their reports for the excavations for Ledford Island. So we had maps, we had notes, we had more than the Bell site, but no full report. They did identify a palisade, a ditch, and structures, and they excavated a pretty large block excavation. You can see the block excavation here, their map here. So and this is some of the beautiful features from Ledford Island. So one of the great results of the magnetometer survey here is we were able to georeference the Lewis and Nieberg maps. So we were able to identify some features that they had identified and get them georeferenced. And of course, it's not perfect, but we have a much better idea of where these features are. And because we have these results, we also know that Lewis and Nieberg didn't completely destroy these features, that they actually uncovered a lot of them and then covered them back up. And we also were able to expand the village boundaries, follow the palisade up, and get an idea of the size of the village, the extent of the palisade, and also the second possible plaza. So this plaza was identified by Lewis and Nieberg. And then we have a second one up here, which Lynn Sullivan tells me is not something that's supposed to be there. There shouldn't be a second plaza. She didn't want it to be. She kept being like, "No, are you sure?" So the other really interesting thing we were able to do with the GPR results is we think we were able to make a distinction between winter and summer houses. So winter houses were more substantial construction, maybe slightly subterranean, and summer houses are a more ephemeral construction. And we went back and looked at the GPR results, and here's a profile of GPR, and you can see something we think is a winter house, the more substantial construction, and it's full of debris, but it's going to see the floor here and make that distinction on the maps. So Long Island. This is a survey that we did in 2017. It's another natural island. It's on the Tennessee River. Mississippian features have been inundated and are underwater on Long Island. We actually were able to georeference the maps from this one. The island was 476 acres before the river was flooded, and today it is 110 acres. There's one known burial mound still above water, but we weren't actually able to survey that. It was completely in a wooded area and right by the shoreline. But we just did gradiometer on all the open areas of the island. So it's 42 acres of gradiometer survey. And I'm including this one in the report because it's a really good example of how a site where the Mississippian component is quote unquote gone, and how we can identify kind of existing features and other temporal components to a site that are still there. So Thomas and Emmert from the Smithsonian collected on this island, and they made this sweet map, which has been annotated later with some of the WPA features that they identified. The WPA recorded 19 mounds and 9 open habitations, which are all underwater right now. They've never made any formal feature maps, never produced a report. You can see our common theme on these projects. But we had some better maps on this one and a better idea of where the historic shoreline was. So we were able to georeference more of the historic, like the WPA acquisition maps and stuff, and had a better idea that things were underwater here. So we did identify 2 concentrations of habitations and some historic features. So we have one on the north side of the island. Up here, the brown are all what we interpret as structures, possible structures, and down on the south side of the island here. So we have diagnostic artifacts from shoreline surveys that indicate that there were late Paleo-Indian and late woodland and early Mississippian occupations on this island. So our hypothesis is that these were seasonal habitations or small villages that maybe belonged to the woodland or early Mississippian period. Before people were living in these giant walled villages. So it's just very useful for management purposes for the TVA, and also to remind us that, just because something's underwater doesn't mean that there's not something above water. So here is a map of the whole island, kind of showing our broad interpretations. And then on this map on the left, you can see the original island shoreline outlined in the dotted line. So the last one is Bustle Island, which I'm really excited to talk to you all about because we just finished this project, and these are very new results. This is the first time I've talked about them, and it was very exciting results. So this is the natural islands that's at the confluence of the Little Tennessee and the Tennessee rivers. Artifacts have been identified on this island from early Archaic to the historic period. I'm going to talk about the Mississippian period, but just know that every time I talk about this Mississippian village, there are deeply buried early Archaic artifacts confirmed on this site. So this is a very, very deep and intensely occupied island. You can kind of see why. It's right at the confluence of 2 kind of major rivers in this area. It was I'm trying to remember which one. It was dammed in the 1970s and created the Tellico and the Loudon reservoirs. So there's not much of the island left. But there's the part of the island where they have identified these deep deposits, and the Mississippian village has not been inundated at all. However, it is very easy to get to. You can see this is a major road, publicly accessible. There's another road that goes right up to the site. There's been generations of looting, plowing, and archaeology. And the TVA really was wondering if there was anything left. If you walk out there, you can see looters' pits. There's a lot of archaeology that's been done here. They were kind of wondering if there's any research potential left on this island. A lot of people have worked on Bustle. The Smithsonian has been there. Our buddies Thomas and Emmert were there in 1886. They documented 2 mounds and something that they called the Great Midden, which if you walk up, the Great Midden is still pretty great. You actually still walk up on top of it. It's over on right up here. This is pretty much all what they called the Great Midden. Only one of those mounds is visible today. The Hay Foundation came a little bit after the Smithsonian folks and did some excavations there too. Most of those two expeditions were focusing on burials to get artifacts for their museums. UT did some work here too, as between 1970 and 1974, the Tennessee Archaeological Society, ostensibly under the supervision of a UT professor, did a bunch of excavations here. They're an advocational group. They were very poorly supervised as far as I can tell. We don't really know where those excavations took place, and not all of the collections have made their way back to UT. So, and there was no analysis ever done, no reporting ever done. We have some pictures. They didn't screen their dirt. They didn't really, I don't think they really dug in levels. You know, they were having fun, I guess. So they did most of their excavations, we think, up in this part. That's why it's such a big box, because we don't really know. And then later in the 1970s, Chapman came and did some deep testing, which is how we know about the early archaic occupation over here in these areas. And they also did some salvage of looting, like deep looting pits. They did some salvage excavations within the looting pits. And then in 1992, Polimus came and did some shovel testing and augering, which you can see roughly where we think that was here. And here is the map made by our Smithsonian friends. You can see this is the Great Midden, and there's Mounds. And here's what the island looks like today. So we did Gradyometer and GPR survey of all the open areas. It's about 5 acres on this island. So just really quick, this is a transmission line pole. So, and there's actually a transmission line, a really high transmission line running right here. So right up here, you can see off the bat, this is where that Great Midden was. These are probably almost all looters' pits. But we did identify those extensive disturbances, and we kind of drew a circle around them and be like, this is where a lot of the looting has taken place. But there were a large number of intact features. So both mounds that were originally identified in 1886, one of which, the southern one, is actually not visible on the surface today. So right here. And then here's another section of the mound where it's kind of built into the Great Midden. This is a plaza between them, which is also identified by the Smithsonian. Plaza feature. Also, most interestingly, is a large number of habitation structures pretty far away from where anyone had done looting or excavations before, including 4 community structures, which are they're in pink on this map. And you can see, oops, there we go. They're much larger than your typical kind of dwelling structure, about 8 meters squared in area. And here's an example of one excavated, which is from the Dallas site. And they have a central hearth as well as pole structure around. They're generally pretty rectilinear. And here is what they look like in the MAG data. We also saw them in the GPR data as well. And so we have 4 of those visible on this site. So a site that we had thought we were questioning if there was any intact features. We have 4 Mississippian community structures, Dallas period community houses. And then up above here you can see those 2 mounds in the MAG data. It's very faint. So these surveys really represent the same methods being used at a variety of sites. The results really vary based on the type of sites. But there are clear Mississippian village patterns on every site that we worked on except Long Island. With those, not all of them have palisades, but most of them do. We've got some that don't have mounds, some that do. They all have some. All these sites have been previously excavated in some capacity. These early first. That was very useful for all of us because we could take this data and put it in space. From in some cases, those they, you know, regardless of whether they could be georeferenced, they provide very useful. But I think the most important takeaway is that no site was completely destroyed. A great deal. Hiawassee Island, I'm proud to say, has been officially listed. It got through the state review, so landscape level understanding of the sites, which is just so valuable. And there's a lot, but there's a lot we can figure out just from this perspective, and then we can come. So thanks so much for having me. Thanks for inviting me here. I did want my co-author, collaborators, Sean Patch and Sullivan, is completely invaluable. Whole job going through file cabinets of papers and artifacts. Already underwriters of all this work, as loaned us the McClung Museum, and then all the people. Missing people, but thank you.
Talking to us today. Are there any questions? Yes.
Knowing the process and how you have to do it in chunks at a time. I noticed the recent one would be dark blue. Why is
rained the night before or after? And a lot of this data, like showing you the slice maps, is almost, and the slice maps are kind of one of our last places we look for results. Average them for different, so if it rains and there gets to be a lot of water or another, you end up with that kind of discrepancy. You can do things to compensate for that, but because we end up making most of our interpretations data, it just ends up being a visual thing.
I'll find that you're using multiple techniques on each site. What are kind of some of the factors that one technique or the other, or what? Some of the cases, are they all kind of different?
Largely because we don't use them a whole lot because if you're doing 150 acres, doing we generally find if there's a lot of historic materials and they post-date metal on historic sites, then MAG is not going to be super useful. MAG features, or even subtle early historic features. Not going to survey 150 acres with GPR. And even MAG is a lot faster and it's a lot more efficient for these pre-contact. But that being said, it's in my opinion, grain features. It's how we could distinguish between a winter house and a. So.
Are there any other questions?
Volume about all of these Mississippian villages, an interesting potential synthesis.
Oh man. I mean, the problem right now is going through all of these. It's probably notes and do the analysis, and the sites vary on what's actually still in the here various places. There's no plans on our end. Perspective would be to take the geophysics as a really small component of it and go through sort of volume about the historic excavations, because that's what's really missing work.
Thank you for having me.
As I mentioned in the beginning, please keep your Archaeology Month events. We've got rack cards back here, so get those on your calendar. And we hope to see you next month.